Welcome back, survivor. If you can hear this, it means you're still alive. This is Jack's Nightmares, and this is your next story. The office still felt normal that week. I remember walking in before sunrise on Monday, the glass walls reflecting nothing but my own outline and the first glow off the Hudson. New York moved like it always did, too fast to think and too loud to care. My company's headquarters sat high on the 34th floor, quiet at that hour except for the hum of servers and the click of cooling ducts. I ran a legitimate trade firm on paper, energy commodities, supply logistics, but the real profits came from specialized contracts that skirted the edges of defense manufacturing. Everything licensed, everything checked, but close enough to the line that I could read world tension like a stock ticker. My name's Marcus Vale, 49, born in Newark, raised on docks and debt. I built this business from refinery scraps and political favors. My wife, Renee, 45, once ran trauma shifts at Staten Island University Hospital before retiring 5 years ago. She knows medicine, schedules, and when I'm hiding something. Our kids still lived with us on Tot Hill. Noah, 22, who studied business but spent more time welding parts in the garage. And Ava, 15, still in high school, sharp as glass but too online for her own good. Sophia Park, Noah's girlfriend, had practically moved in by then. She was calm, observant, the kind of person who stayed quiet until her words mattered. Renee's mother, Marina Costa, 67, handled the house garden. My father, Harold Vale, 74, used to pilot tugboats around Port Newark. He said he'd die if he had to live inland. I told him we had a view of the bay, close enough. Also, we had staff, though I never liked the word. Derek Shaw ran security, an ex-cop with more instincts than patience. His 2 guards, Jared Pike and Owen Mbaye, rotated day and night. Augusto Gus Palladino, a mechanic who could fix anything with a spark plug, handled maintenance. Mei Lu, the cook, kept everyone fed. Consuela Alvarez, housekeeping. Zahir Khan, the janitor who worked odd hours and never asked questions. Everyone had quarters on site. That's what made the place run smooth. The estate itself sat above the tree line on Tot Hill, 3 acres, a view of the harbor, and a fence tall enough to keep wildlife out. It wasn't a fortress yet, just expensive privacy. Cameras dotted the corners. Power came from the grid, backed by solar panels, 3 small wind turbines, and a diesel generator in a sound-insulated room under the garage. Water ran through the city main with a backup cistern. Everything normal. That Monday felt typical until about 9 a.m. when I caught a small piece on a financial wire about unexpected health incidents overseas. It didn't say where, just hinted that 2 major ports were increasing inspection times for inbound flights. The language was vague. I flagged it for later and went back to work. Around noon, Langley, my finance chief, called from our Jersey branch. He'd heard that the Department of Defense was quietly buying up specific components, protective gear, non-lethal crowd control systems. No public contracts yet, but the order flow was unusual. I asked if our name was attached. He said not yet. That word again. When I drove home that evening, the Verrazano Bridge was lit and clear. No checkpoints, no convoys. I stopped for groceries because Renee wanted fresh vegetables. At dinner, the house buzzed like it always did. Ava scrolling on her phone. Noah and Sophia arguing about a half-finished drone. Harold telling a story from his tugboat days. Nothing felt strange. After everyone went to bed, I spent an hour in the comms room running inventory numbers for no reason I could explain. Tuesday morning started calm. The news called it a new respiratory virus spreading in parts of Asia, comparing it to previous flus. Airports were screening passengers, and that was all. Renee watched the broadcast while making coffee and said hospitals were already seeing people worried sick. Literally. She laughed when she said it, but her tone wasn't relaxed. She had that quiet read nurses get when things don't add up. I told her it'd burn out by spring. I didn't believe it. At the office, Langley called again. This time he sounded uneasy. He'd intercepted a logistics bulletin, unofficial, mentioning emergency supply routes and priority clearance for medical convoys. None of it was public yet. I spent the rest of the morning approving contracts and pretending to ignore it. By evening, 2 co-workers were wearing masks on the elevator. No mandates, just nerves. Home life stayed ordinary. Gus repaired a small section of the south fence. Harold supervised, pretending to help. The security team rotated shifts like usual. I grilled chicken with Renee, opened a bottle of wine, and talked about nothing. The city below glowed like always. Internet worked. Water pressure strong. Lights steady. When the generators tested at 1900 hours, they hummed perfect. I logged it, shut everything down, and forgot about the world until morning. Wednesday opened with cold air and clear skies. Traffic reports mentioned delays near Staten Island University Hospital because of staffing shortages. Renee's phone buzzed every few minutes. Old colleagues asking about supplies, patient overflow, and a rumor of ambulances rerouting cases from Manhattan. She tried calling her former department head. No answer. By noon, national outlets finally covered the first domestic cases. The footage showed crowded terminals and officials in half-buttoned protective suits giving calm interviews that didn't look calm. I left work early that day, took the long way home past the ferry terminal. Crowds were smaller than usual, but every third person wore a mask. People talked softer. In line for gas, a man argued with the cashier about disinfectant wipes. No shouting, just tension. The city was still functioning, just slower. That evening, Derek briefed me on a potential uptick in petty theft across the island. Mostly car break-ins, probably unrelated, but he wanted permission to double night patrols. I said yes. Gus asked if he could move some spare fencing material from the outer storage into the main lot for weather reasons. I approved that too. Small things, but they mattered. At dinner, Marina prayed longer than usual. Ava noticed. Noah changed the subject to a project he wanted to start. Retrofitting the old wind turbines with adjustable blades. I said, go ahead. Sophia volunteered to help with software control. The talk drifted back to the news until Renee shut it down with one look. By Thursday morning, my inbox was full of internal memos about temporary travel restrictions. Flights rerouted, cargo delayed, clients panicking. I spent half the day calming investors, and the other half watching government feeds. At 2 p.m., a federal update confirmed limited quarantine zones overseas. Stock markets dipped, then stabilized. Nothing in the wording screamed disaster, but the tone was careful. Too careful. Renee called around 3. One of her old colleagues had sent her a private message saying several emergency room staff had fallen sick, fast. Symptoms were unpredictable. Some patients went catatonic, others lashed out. She asked if we should start prepping just in case. I told her we were already prepped. She asked if I believed it. I said yes. That night, I sat with Harold on the deck. He smoked a cigar, said the harbor looked busier than usual. More patrol boats, more lights near the bridge. I watched them through binoculars. He was right. I made a note to check flight schedules in the morning. Friday felt heavier before sunrise. I left for the office at 6 and passed 3 ambulances heading toward the hospital. The radio repeated a government advisory telling citizens to avoid unnecessary travel. Inside the building, half the staff didn't show up. The rest pretended everything was fine. By noon, the company intranet went down for 30 minutes. When it came back, 2 internal chat channels had been wiped clean. Langley called to say several federal procurement officers were off the grid. He didn't know why. I packed up early, locked the office, and drove home through quieter streets. Police cruisers blocked side roads near the ferry. No explanation. I turned up the hill and felt that strange mix of calm and distance, the kind that hits before a storm even when the sky looks clear. The house lights glowed across the yard. Renee met me at the door and said the hospital where she used to work had gone into temporary lockdown. She didn't have details. We ate dinner anyway. Later that night, when the family went to bed, I sat in the comms room watching news streams from around the world. Images of sealed terminals, hospital tents, soldiers wearing gear meant for chemical fires. My company's product line, the shields, the armor plates, the gas filtration, were being mentioned in procurement requests now. I closed the screen, leaned back, and listened to the steady hum of our generator test cycle below. Power perfect, internet strong, city still lit. When morning came, the house was quiet except for the coffee maker clicking on and the faint static from Harold's shortwave in the kitchen. Renee was already up, hair tied back, scrolling through her phone with that look she used to have before a double shift. She told me the hospital where she used to work had gone on what they called preventive isolation, meaning no visitors and controlled exits. The news on television kept calling it temporary. I said that was good. Precaution was better than denial. She looked at me, smiled once, and said she hoped I was right. Downstairs, Gus and Derek were standing by the maintenance shed, checking the fence line schedule. Derek had printed a report about petty thefts around the island, mostly break-ins at gas stations and storage units. He said it was probably panic buying, people stealing before stock disappeared. I told him to double night patrols anyway. He said he'd rotate Jared and Owen and keep the drones on standby. We both knew it was overkill for now, but routines mattered. Around 9, I sat in my home office and opened the company terminal. The server lag was worse than the day before. One of our suppliers in Virginia had stopped answering emails. The message queue filled with automatic alerts about supply chain disruptions due to international screening. It didn't feel coordinated, more like bureaucracy starting to choke itself. I sent 3 messages to Langley asking for clarity and got one short reply, working on it. By 10:30, the mayor's press conference went live. He stood in front of a clean blue backdrop with the health commissioner beside him. The city wasn't shutting down, he said, just taking sensible precautions. Schools were to stay open, ferries would operate at reduced capacity to allow sanitation breaks, and citizens were advised to report anyone displaying extreme confusion, erratic aggression, or unexplained collapse. The words sounded harmless until you heard how carefully he said them. Renee muted the television after the broadcast ended. She said, "They're not telling the whole story." I said, "They never do." She asked if I thought it was spreading here yet. I didn't answer fast enough, so she asked again. I said maybe. She nodded once and started making a list on the back of a receipt. Bandages, alcohol wipes, saline, gloves, old habits. By midday, the air outside looked sharper, too bright for winter. I stepped out onto the deck and watched the skyline across the bay. Manhattan looked untouched from here, glass towers shining, nothing moving slower than usual. From a distance, a crisis always hides behind the reflection. Down the street, a delivery van stopped at a neighbor's gate and left a package without knocking. The driver didn't even cut the engine. At 1 o'clock, I called a quick staff meeting in the garage. Everyone came except Consuela, who was upstairs cleaning. I explained that the situation might tighten over the next few days, that we should expect delays on deliveries, and maybe spot checks from police. Derek asked if we'd start restricting gate access. I told him yes, essential entries only, no friends, no guests, no exceptions. Gus said he'd finish replacing the south side bolts before nightfall and test the cameras again. I reminded everyone that the grid was stable, so the generator stays off unless we lose power longer than 10 minutes. The less noise, the better. By mid-afternoon, Langley finally called. He sounded tired, said he'd heard whispers about a federal request to repurpose private manufacturing for emergency containment hardware. That meant cages or barricades, depending on the angle. I asked if we were on the list. He said not yet, but the paperwork was moving fast. I asked what containment meant. He said no one knew, but someone at Homeland had mentioned neurological aggression. I told him to stop repeating rumors until he had something written. He laughed once and hung up. When I walked back through the main hallway, Ava was on the couch, eyes fixed on her phone. She said social feeds were flooded with clips from hospitals overseas. Patients shaking, restrained, screaming at cameras. I told her to turn it off. She didn't move, so I reached over and did it myself. She said she just wanted to know what was happening. I said she'd know soon enough. Dinner was quiet except for the dog pacing near the table. Marina said her friend from church had called crying because her husband was trapped overseas. All flights suspended. Harold said travel bans never hold. Someone always gets through. Renee didn't talk much. She just kept glancing at the clock and checking her phone. Afterward, she cleaned up faster than usual and went straight to the comms room to listen for hospital chatter on the emergency band. At 8 that evening, I walked the perimeter with Derek. The air smelled like salt and diesel from the docks. He pointed out that the cameras caught more foot traffic on the service road. People walking where no one used to walk, cutting through neighborhoods after bus service dropped. I told him to keep the lights dimmed and motion sensors armed, but to avoid confrontations. He said he understood. We both knew what avoid meant if someone jumped the fence. Inside, Noah was in the garage testing the smaller generator. He'd logged each runtime since last winter. Clean numbers, no issues. Sophia sat on a stool nearby with a tablet open, building a power management app for him. She was good at that kind of work, silent but steady. She looked up when I walked in and asked if the news was getting worse. I told her it depends who you ask. She said she'd stop checking. She didn't. Renee came down around 9 holding a printed sheet. She'd transcribed a message from a friend still working at the hospital. It said the ER had overflowed with violent cases, that several staff were bitten during restraints, and that new admissions were being diverted. She said the message wasn't official, just personal. I took it, read it twice, and told her to keep it quiet until more confirmed reports came out. She said, "It's already confirmed for me." Then she left the room. Later, I sat in the comms room again. The local scanner picked up police dispatch near the ferry terminal. Individual non-responsive, violent reaction to restraint, requesting medical. A pause, then the same unit asking for backup. That was the first time I heard it in our city, not on a feed from somewhere else. I wrote down the time, 10:36 p.m. By midnight, the air outside was still, lights from Manhattan muted under thin clouds. The house systems read normal across every monitor, diesel tanks full, food inventory exact, water pressure strong, yet it didn't feel right. I turned off the scanner, looked at the silent monitors, and thought about what Renee's colleague had described. People biting through gloves, lungs working after death, nerves still firing. It sounded impossible, but so did everything the first time you heard it. Before I went upstairs, I checked each lock and motion sensor manually. Old habit. In the hallway, I paused by Ava's door. She was awake, screen glow under the blanket. I didn't scold her. Let her have the illusion of normal. Noah's room light was off. Sophia's too. Harold snored faintly in the guest room. Renee's side of the bed was cold when I lay down. She was still in the kitchen writing notes. When I woke up, it was almost 7. The blinds were half open and light filled the room unevenly. Renee was sitting on the edge of the bed, hair tied, same clothes from the night before. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. I asked if she'd come up at all. She said she couldn't. She'd been listening to emergency radio traffic all night. I asked what it said, and she answered that she wasn't sure yet. The codes didn't make sense. Hospitals were asking for assistance. Police were redirecting ambulances, and most calls ended mid-transmission. That was the first time I saw fear in her eyes since the day our son was born, and I didn't know what to do with it. Downstairs, Harold had the shortwave tuned to a maritime frequency. A lot of chatter from harbor patrol units, more than usual for a calm morning. He said there was a freighter anchored outside the bay that hadn't answered its inspection call. No one knew if it was crew illness or something else. Renee poured him coffee and said not to spread rumors until something confirmed. He said it wasn't rumor if he heard it on air. Then he turned the volume up. The city news reported the first official containment measure. Not lockdown, not quarantine, just containment. 2 hospitals under review for infection protocol failures. The anchors looked tired, still smiling for the camera, but with that pause before every sentence. The broadcast cut to a reporter outside Staten Island University Hospital, the same place Renee used to work. The camera stayed on her face while a siren wailed behind her. When she looked over her shoulder, I saw movement near the ambulance bay, fast and erratic. The feed switched back to studio before she finished her sentence. I called Langley right after that. He said the main servers had gone into restricted access overnight. He wasn't sure if it was government interference or a power glitch, but 3 of our partners overseas had locked their inventory. We had open contracts sitting in limbo. I asked if he'd seen the news. He said yes, and that half his staff had already left. I told him to back up everything offline and shut the office until further notice. He asked how long that would be. I said I didn't know. He laughed once and said that made 2 of us. At the estate, everything looked stable. Cameras online, sensors green, fence power steady. Gus was on the south run tightening bolts with the small electric wrench, Zahir sweeping leaves off the walkway. Even the air smelled clean, but the roads below were busier than usual for a weekday morning. I watched from the deck as lines of cars stretched toward the bridge. Something was happening. Panic disguised as precaution. Around 10, Renee asked if we should start limiting staff movement off-site. She didn't like the idea of people leaving for supplies or personal errands. She said, if it spreads by contact, then every trip's a coin toss. I agreed, and called everyone into the garage. It wasn't formal, just necessary. I explained that we'd hold position until things calmed. Any supplies needed would be ordered by delivery, no one leaving without clearance. Gus said he had everything he needed for a week, maybe more. May nodded and said she could stretch the freezer stock. Derek and Jared looked at each other before Derek asked if that included them. I said yes, all of us. He didn't argue, but I saw the hesitation. By noon, the first government advisory hit the emergency alert system. Phones buzzed across the house. Short vibration, same tone for all networks. The message said, avoid non-essential travel, seek medical care for severe fever or violent disorientation, cooperate with local authorities. That was it. No signature, no timestamp. The simplicity was worse than panic. Renee read it twice before muttering, they're losing control already. I didn't answer. After lunch, Noah asked if he could take the truck down to the tool depot to pick up heavy-duty chains and spare couplers. I said, later, when we know more. He said waiting meant losing options, and he was right. But I wasn't going to send him into the middle of a city starting to panic. Instead, I gave him access to the credit line and told him to order what we needed for delivery: fencing materials, welding rods, more fuel stabilizer, everything on the checklist. He didn't like sitting still, but he did it. Sophia stayed beside him in the garage, cataloging every tool and part on a tablet. She had that calm precision that kept him from doing anything reckless. At 3 in the afternoon, the television cut to emergency coverage again. More hospitals going into controlled access, temporary curfews in 3 states. The feed shifted to a clip recorded by a passenger at Newark Airport. Security officers trying to restrain a man near a checkpoint, 4 of them wrestling him down while another filmed. The audio distorted, but you could hear screams and someone yelling, "He bit her." Then the screen went black. Renee turned it off immediately. She said, "It's not just fever anymore." I said nothing. Derek came in at dusk with a status report. More cars passing along the lower road, some heading toward the bridge, some circling back. He said one car stopped at the front gate and then reversed after spotting the cameras. No incident, but worth noting. I told him to install the second motion sensor cluster near the west corner before nightfall. He nodded, said he'd get Owen to help. Gus followed, wiping grease off his hands, and asked if he could bring his daughter Gianna and her toddler to the estate for a few days. His voice cracked when he said it, which I'd never heard before. He said her apartment was near the ferry terminal, too close to everything happening. I agreed. Renee prepared one of the guest suites and made sure the small generator for that wing was functional. By nightfall, traffic on the roads had thinned. The city lights still glowed, ferries still moved, but the noise was different. Less constant, more cautious. I stood on the deck watching through binoculars. A police helicopter circled over the bridge, spotlight sweeping slow arcs across the lanes. That was new. Renee joined me and said quietly that she'd stocked every first aid kit we had. I asked if she was expecting casualties. She said she didn't know anymore. Inside, Ova sat at the kitchen table doing homework with her headphones in. I envied her for that. Noah and Sophia were in the comms room tracking deliveries. Everything looked fine until around 10 p.m, when the order confirmations froze. The network wasn't down, emails still sent, but the tracking servers had gone offline. Noah said it could be system overload. I said maybe, but I could tell by the way he kept refreshing the page that he didn't believe it either. At 10:30, the first noise came from the outer fence, a metallic rattle, short but distinct. Derek was outside within seconds, rifle slung, flashlight off. He signaled to the camera and I brought up the feed. Nothing visible, probably an animal. Still, we logged the time and checked the perimeter again. No breaches, no shadows. The tension stayed anyway. Harold muttered something about how easy it was for order to disappear when people got scared. He said, all it takes is one wrong rumor. He wasn't wrong. Renee tried to rest around midnight but couldn't. She sat on the edge of the bed with the radio on low volume. The announcer repeated the same instructions. Stay indoors, stay calm, cooperate with authorities. She looked at me and said quietly that those phrases always mean the opposite, that someone somewhere had lost control of a major system. I said, then we hold here. She nodded, closed her eyes for a moment, and told me to get some sleep before sunrise. When I woke again, the light coming through the blinds was pale and diffused. The city skyline beyond the hill looked soft under a low haze. For a second, it almost passed for a normal winter morning. Then I heard Harold's voice echo from the kitchen. He was talking to someone on the radio again. His tone wasn't relaxed. I got dressed and went downstairs. Harold turned down the volume as soon as I stepped in. He said a friend from the harbor reported a security perimeter being set up near the ferry terminal. Coast Guard vessels had cut entry lanes and redirected civilian boats. The explanation was routine biohazard protocol. He said that phrase twice. Renee handed me coffee and said her hospital contact confirmed that Staten Island University had gone into full lockdown overnight. No discharge, no visitors, no new admissions, just containment. By 8, local news channels were looping the same footage, checkpoints forming at bridge entrances, officers in masks scanning foreheads, police cars stacked 2 lanes wide. The anchors read statements about medical screenings and public safety coordination. Behind them, you could see people abandoning their cars and walking back toward the neighborhoods. Renee lowered the volume and said we should assume the bridges would close within 24 hours. I said, that fast? She said yes. If they were following any real protocol, it had to be that fast. Noah came in wearing his jacket, asking if I'd reconsider letting him drive to the hardware depot before restrictions tightened. I told him no again. He argued that we'd regret waiting if this dragged out for weeks. I said we'd adapt with what we had. He didn't push after that, but I could tell he was angry. Sophia followed him out onto the deck a few minutes later, calm as always, saying nothing. At 9, Derek radioed from the outer gate. He said a patrol car had stopped down the hill asking about the property's power setup. They claimed to be documenting critical infrastructure for potential load management. Derek didn't open the gate, just spoke through the intercom. They asked if we had backup generators and fuel on site. He said yes. They wrote something down and drove off without another word. I told him to note the time and keep eyes on the cameras. That was when I decided no one would enter or leave without my direct approval. Around 10:30, Gus returned from the garage with an update. He'd moved the spare concrete panels closer to the inner driveway and was prepping the skid steer for faster deployment. He said he didn't like the way the city sounded from down there. The constant sirens had turned irregular, longer, more desperate. Zahar told him a gas station 2 miles away had lines stretching into the street and a fight had broken out over the pumps. I told them both to lock the side gate and conserve diesel from here on. The power grid flickered around noon, only for a second, but enough to make everyone look up. The televisions blinked off and back on, clocks reset, and one of the security monitors froze until Noah rebooted it. I walked outside, scanned the horizon. Still full daylight, no storm. Renee said maybe it was a rolling load balance, that the city might be rationing grid output to priority zones. She was probably right, but I didn't like how she said maybe. By afternoon, the emergency alert system interrupted every station with the same recorded message. All residents are to remain calm and limit travel. Seek information through verified channels. Rumors cause harm. It played on loop every half hour. The repetition wore people down faster than fear itself. Marina sat in the living room clutching her rosary, eyes fixed on the muted screen. Ava hovered between watching the feeds and taking short videos out the window. I told her to stop filming. She said she was documenting history. I said she was inviting it to our doorstep. She rolled her eyes but closed the curtains. At 3, Derek called me to the gate camera. A civilian truck had stopped near the road shoulder with the hood up. 3 men stood beside it, one holding a red gas can. Derek asked what I wanted to do. I watched through the feed. They weren't uniformed, no badges, no markings. One waved toward the property like he recognized it. I told Derek to wait. They never approached, just looked around, argued for a minute, then got back in the truck and drove away. Derek kept watching until they were out of range. He said, "That'll be more common soon." I didn't disagree. By 4, Gus's daughter Gianna and her child arrived. Derek cleared them through the gate after verifying identity by intercom. She looked pale but alert, said the ferry area was chaos. Barricades, shouting. People fighting for seats that no longer existed. She carried her boy on her hip, wrapped in a blanket. Renee led them inside, gave them food, and set them up in the guest wing. Gus didn't say much, just nodded in gratitude and went back to work without a word. Around 5:30, another advisory rolled across every device. Bridges remain open for essential travel only. Medical transport has priority. Civilian crossing delays may occur. That phrasing, may occur, told me everything. They were already closing. I went to the comms room and switched through local frequencies. 2 police channels were locked in administrative mode, broadcasting automated tones. Another channel was full of chatter, officers calling for roadblocks near the Goethals Bridge and requesting medics who never replied. The word bite came through twice before the feed cut. At dinner, the mood was heavy. The child Gianna brought slept upstairs, which gave everyone an excuse to speak softly. Harold said he'd heard on the shortwave that parts of New Jersey were losing power. Marina asked if that was true. Renee said yes, possibly due to overload, and that hospitals were probably running on generators now. She mentioned that some staff she knew had stopped responding to messages. She said it flatly, as if stating weather conditions. Nobody spoke for a while after that. Later in the evening, Noah and Sophia moved spare batteries into the comms room. Derek tested both drones, hovering them briefly above the yard to check connection range. The hum was faint, the machine stable. I watched from the deck as one of them climbed higher than usual, scanning the slope below. You could see moving headlights on the lower roads, a constant flow heading toward the bridges. The other direction, toward the neighborhoods, was empty. People weren't coming home anymore. They were leaving or stuck. At 9, we lost the local news feed mid-sentence. The screen turned black, then switched to the emergency alert slate again. Same loop, same voice, only now it included a new phrase. Shelter where you are. Follow guidance from medical authorities. The absence of specifics was worse than any number. Renee watched it once, turned the television off, and said, "That's the surrender message." I asked what she meant. She said, "It means there's no plan left except to stay alive." After she went upstairs, I sat in the comms room alone, monitoring open channels. Around 10:45, a transmission from a nearby police unit broke through static. 2 voices, one calm, one panicked. The calm one said, "Bridge compromised. We're sealing access. Do not approach." The other voice shouted something about an officer down, and then went silent. The channel stayed open for 3 minutes with nothing but wind noise before cutting completely. I stared at the screen, waiting for follow-up. Nothing came. I went to the window overlooking the harbor. The Verrazano Bridge was still visible in the distance, illuminated but almost empty. A single car moved across, slow and alone. The rest of the span looked deserted. The water below reflected the lights in a broken line. From somewhere behind me, the generator's low cycle rumbled once as Gus tested the load. I realized then how quiet the neighborhood had become. No laughter from nearby houses, no distant traffic hum, just wind and the faint crack of metal contracting in the cold. Before midnight, I made another perimeter round with Derek. We moved through the yard, flashlights dimmed, scanning the fence line. Nothing moved. He asked if I thought the city would hold. I said, "Cities don't hold, people do." He said he'd heard radio chatter from old contacts still on duty. Officers being told to abandon posts after bridges were sealed, some refusing, others already gone. He said the next 48 hours would decide everything. I said then, we'd decide for ourselves. When I finally got back inside, the family was asleep except for Renee. She was sitting on the couch with the lamp off, a notebook open in her lap. She said she was making a medical reference list, supplies, symptoms, dosages, because she couldn't rely on hospitals anymore. I sat beside her, took the pen, and wrote the word containment across the top of the page. We didn't speak after that. The generator kicked on once more, filling the silence with a deep mechanical breath before settling back into quiet. The next morning started under a grey sky. Low clouds hung over the bay, and the light carried that flat tone that makes every sound sharper. I walked the property with coffee in hand, checking the gates, cameras, and fuel levels. Everything looked the same as yesterday, but the air felt wrong, still, heavy, almost too clean. From the deck, I could see the bridge in the distance, but the usual line of vehicles was gone. Only a few lights flickered between the spans. The absence made the whole skyline feel hollow. Renee joined me a few minutes later, coat half zipped, still holding the same notebook. She said the morning broadcasts were limited, mostly repeat statements. Some anchors were broadcasting from their homes. The phrase, temporary civil containment, had replaced medical emergency. She said it quietly, as if saying it louder might make it real. I said, "That's the language they use when they can't call it a quarantine." She didn't argue. We both watched the skyline for a while before she went back inside to check on Marina. By mid-morning, Gus and Derek were already outside reinforcing the south fence. They'd pulled out the skid steer and started moving spare concrete blocks from the lot to line the weaker sections. I stood with them for a while, watching the machine crawl along the yard. Derek said the radio chatter from local law enforcement had gone silent overnight, which usually meant an order had come down to consolidate or abandon posts. He said, "If they're pulling back, that means nobody's in control anymore." I said, "Then we stay ahead of them." He nodded and went back to work. At 9:45, a rumble echoed across the hill from the harbor. Not loud, but deep. One of those sounds that carried through your chest more than your ears. Harold came out onto the porch and said it was a demolition charge. The city must have blown a bridge segment or shipping lane. Renee asked if that was confirmed. He said he could tell by the echo pattern. I didn't argue. You don't spend 40 years piloting tugboats without learning what explosions sound like. Inside, the kids were awake. Ava had her laptop open, streaming whatever channels still worked. Most feeds had frozen on the same government slate. White text on blue background. She asked if she could call her friend in Queens. I said no, the lines needed to stay open. She said, "What difference does one call make?" I said, "We'll need every channel when it matters." That shut her down, but not for long. By late morning, Renee called a quick meeting in the dining room. She wanted everyone to go through basic sanitation protocols: hand washing, surface disinfection, food rotation. It sounded small compared to the chaos outside, but it gave everyone something to do. May took notes, writing lists of what we were short on: bleach, vinegar, disposable gloves. She said we could stretch supplies for a month if we were careful. I told her we'd resupply once deliveries stabilized, though I didn't believe that would happen. Around noon, Derek spotted movement through the front cameras. A van had stopped just outside the main gate. The paint was faded, the side marked with a medical transport logo. 3 adults and 2 children inside. The man driving waved a white cloth through the window. Derek asked for instructions. I watched from the comms monitor, zoomed in as far as the camera allowed. The driver's face was pale, eyes unfocused. The passenger beside him slumped forward, head against the dash. Renee stood beside me, silent. I told Derek to approach the intercom, but not open the gate. The man said they'd been driving since dawn, that the hospitals were full, that they just needed gas and somewhere safe for the night. His voice was steady until he mentioned the children, then it cracked. Renee whispered that one of the kids looked feverish. She wanted to bring them water and food, said it was the right thing to do. I said, "We can give them supplies from the drop chute." She said, "They need help, not rations." We argued in low voices while the family waited at the gate. In the end, I overruled her. I told Derek to deliver food, gas, and medical kits, but not to open the fence. He took a dolly, placed the supplies halfway between the fence and the road, and backed away. The driver stepped out, grabbed the packages, and then suddenly bolted toward the gate. Derek dropped the dolly and hit the control panel, slamming the barrier shut before the man reached it. The impact shook the steel. The man shouted something I couldn't hear, then staggered back to the van. One of the kids screamed as they sped off, bouncing over the curb. Renee didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, it was just, "We've crossed the line now." I said, "We had to." She said, "I wasn't talking about them." The rest of the afternoon passed slow. Gus finished the last of the concrete lining. Derek tested the drones again, running perimeter sweeps every 30 minutes. Each flight showed more abandoned cars along the lower road. At one point, we counted 12 in a single stretch. Doors open, hazard lights blinking. None of the drivers in sight. The sense of vacuum was worse than any chaos could have been. By 5, the sky had darkened into a dull orange haze from distant fires. The news channels still active showed plumes rising from across the river, probably electrical substations or gas lines. Harold said he'd seen it before during the blackout years ago. Only this time, the emergency services weren't moving. I asked if he still had contacts at the harbor. He said no, the shortwave chatter had gone dead since morning. Dinner was quiet again. Gianna's son cried upstairs, a dry, tired cry that stopped only when May brought him warm milk. The house felt smaller with every passing hour. Marina tried to lighten the mood by saying prayers at the table, but even her voice shook halfway through. Ava didn't eat much, just moved her food around and kept glancing toward the window. She asked if the lights outside should stay on. I said no, darkness meant safety now. She nodded and turned off the lamp nearest her. After dinner, I joined Derek in the comms room. We cycled through the external feeds, zooming along the fence lines and the access road. At 8:30, one of the cameras caught 3 silhouettes moving near the lower trees, too far to identify, but the pattern wasn't random. One stopped, crouched, and then moved toward the gate. Derek tightened his grip on the console, ready to activate the lights. I said, "Wait." The figure stood still for nearly a minute, then turned and walked back into the dark. The others followed. I told Derek to mark the timestamp and review the footage later. He said he'd already saved it. At 9, the power grid dipped again. For 20 seconds, the estate went black. Backup batteries switched on automatically, and the generator stayed idle by design. When lights returned, one of the interior cameras failed to reconnect. Noah worked on it for half an hour before realizing the cable had been chewed through near the basement vent. He said it looked like a rat or a small animal. Still, I didn't like it. We sealed the vent with steel mesh that night. Renee checked her radio before bed and said hospitals were no longer answering distress calls. Instead, automated recordings played on repeat, directing people to remain home until further notice. She said that meant the staff had either fled or were overwhelmed. She didn't say which she believed. I told her she'd done enough for now, that we needed rest. She said rest was for people who trusted tomorrow. When I woke up the next morning, the air in the house felt stale, like the air conditioning had stopped circulating during the night. The grid was still running, but something in the hum of the system sounded different, slower. I checked the power panel in the comms room, green lights across the board, all normal, but the unease didn't leave. Outside, fog rolled up from the harbor, swallowing the bottom of the hill. From up here it looked peaceful, but I knew what was hiding in it. Roadblocks, stranded cars, people stuck in limbo between home and nowhere. Harold was already on the porch with his radio. He said he'd been listening since dawn and barely caught 2 coherent transmissions. One from a cargo ship requesting permission to dock, and another from Coast Guard denying all entry. Renee joined him with coffee, still half asleep but sharp as ever. She told him to stay off certain frequencies. A few of them were carrying looped distress beacons, and hearing the same cries over and over wasn't good for anyone's nerves. Harold didn't argue but kept the volume low. At 8:30, Derek called me to the comms room. He looked serious but controlled. The front gate cameras had captured 3 people walking along the main road toward the property, all wearing vests marked with emergency medical service badges. They were carrying clipboards and small bags, not weapons. He said one of them knocked on the outer fence post, calling for the homeowner by name. That detail stopped me. They shouldn't have known who lived here. I told Derek to hold position and not to engage until I confirmed. We watched through the main monitor as the group stood by the gate. One woman was older, maybe in her 50s. The other 2 looked younger. The woman spoke clearly through the intercom, saying they were performing wellness checks for vulnerable residents as part of a citywide safety initiative. Her voice sounded calm, rehearsed, almost professional. Renee stood beside me, arms folded, eyes narrowing at the uniform patches. She whispered that the badges didn't match any current city design. The logo was wrong. The fonts were off. I said, "So, Impersonators." She said, "Or worse." I pressed the intercom and asked for their names and department contact. The woman hesitated before answering, saying their identification numbers were in the vehicle. I told her to hold them up to the camera. She said they'd left their IDs at the office. I told them to leave. Her tone shifted immediately. She said, "We're just trying to help people like you, sir." I said, "You can help by moving on." The 3 of them stepped back from the gate, whispered something to each other, and walked down the road. Derek followed them on camera until they turned out of sight. He marked the time and saved the footage. Renee said quietly that it wouldn't be the last visit. She was right. Fake uniforms meant there were still organized groups out there trying to look official. Desperation takes structure when it can. I called everyone into the garage afterward. We reviewed the footage frame by frame. Gus pointed out that the bags those people carried were empty. No bulges. No visible weight. Derek noticed one man had a sidearm tucked under his vest. That was enough proof. I told everyone that from now on, no outside contact would be considered legitimate without prior verification through the satellite terminal. The rule was simple. If they came to help, they weren't real. Later in the morning, the fog lifted, and the sunlight made the yard look normal again. That's what unsettled me most. How easy it was to forget. The garden still held dew, birds still moved through the trees, and the wind turbines turned smooth. If you didn't have a radio or a conscience, you could believe the world was fine. I walked the fence line alone, stopping at the southern corner where the road bent out of sight. A pair of sneakers lay on the shoulder, one upright, one on its side, both soaked through. Small detail, but it anchored everything. At 10:40, Ava came running into the comms room with her phone. She'd been scrolling through a feed cached from the night before, showing footage from a grocery store in Manhattan. People storming the aisles, not for food but for medicine, painkillers, antibiotics, antiseptic wipes. Security had given up trying to stop them. Renee took the phone, looked once, and handed it back. She said, "That'll happen here by tomorrow." I told Ava to stop reading that garbage and help her grandmother inventory medical supplies. She muttered something under her breath and walked out. By noon, the generator ran a 10-minute cycle to top off the battery reserves. The hum echoed through the floors, loud enough that it drew Gianna's son from his nap crying. Gus took him outside for air, walking the perimeter until the noise died down. When he came back in, he said he'd seen smoke rising from the east near the industrial park. He didn't think it was an accident. Looked like controlled burning. Derek checked the thermal feed and confirmed heat blooms along that direction. Someone was clearing ground, probably trying to create a barrier. Renee said that kind of effort only comes after containment fails. At 1:15, we got our first sign that the city's communication grid was collapsing. The satellite terminal began dropping packets every few minutes, forcing disconnections. Noah ran diagnostics and said the issue wasn't on our end. He said some of the nodes were going dark completely, meaning entire relay stations were offline. I told him to archive all local files and close external access. From now on, our network stayed isolated. He looked uneasy, like cutting that last digital tie was too final. Sophia reached over, hit the switch, and said quietly that it was safer this way. Renee spent the afternoon teaching May and Marina basic first aid for wounds, burns, and fever control. I listened from the hall. Her voice was steady, mechanical, as if detachment was the only way to keep her sanity. When I stepped in, she handed me a printed list of what we were running low on: antibiotics, antiseptics, and multivitamins. She said, "We had all this money, all this gear, and not enough pills to fight an infection." I said, "That's always how it ends." She didn't reply. Around 4, the wind shifted east, bringing a faint metallic odor. Not smoke, more like iron mixed with salt water. Harold noticed it too. He stood at the edge of the deck, staring toward the harbor. The waterline shimmered oddly, the kind of distortion you get from heat or fire. He said there was debris drifting near the docks, maybe pieces of boats. I told him to keep his eyes open and not to draw attention with the radio. He said he wasn't broadcasting, just listening. By early evening, Derek reported that both drones were showing battery decay faster than normal, probably interference from the thicker fog rolling back inland. He kept one grounded and used the other for a final sweep before dark. It picked up a lone figure walking along the main road, moving unevenly, head jerking with each step. Derek zoomed in and caught the person's face. Eyes glazed, jaw slack, streaks of dried blood along the chin. The person wasn't running, just staggering forward. We watched until the figure drifted off camera toward the lower turn. Derek didn't say a word. He just shut the feed off. Dinner came late. Everyone was tense. Even Gianna's boy sensed it and wouldn't eat. Renee kept glancing at the door like she expected another knock. Marina tried to talk about ordinary things, the garden, the weather, but nobody followed. I ate quietly, mind running through numbers. How much fuel we had left, how many calories per person per day, how long the fence could hold if things turned violent. Those weren't fears anymore. They were logistics. After dinner, I took the flashlight and walked the property again with Derek. The air was colder now, sharp enough to sting when you breathed. We passed the storage shed where Gus kept his tools, and Derek asked if I'd seen his men recently. I said yes. Both Jared and Owen were inside doing inventory. He nodded but didn't look convinced. He said if the city was gone, his duty ended too, and he wanted to know how far I expected him to follow orders. I said, as far as you value your life. He didn't take offense. He just said, fair enough. At 9, we heard another noise from the outer road. This time voices. 2 men shouting, one calling for help. We turned off the lights, used the thermal feed. 2 bright shapes near the curve. One kneeling, one standing over him. The standing figure bent down, then jerked up suddenly and sprinted toward the woods. The kneeling one didn't move again. Derek exhaled slowly and said, "We should check the fence before dawn." I told him we'd wait. He didn't argue. The night stretched longer than usual after that. Nobody slept much. Every creak in the house felt heavier. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps through wet grass. When morning came, fog covered the yard thick enough that you couldn't see the first gate. The cameras blurred white, showing nothing but shifting shapes. I walked into the kitchen and found Renee already awake, staring out the window. She didn't look surprised anymore, just tired. She said she'd heard a few emergency broadcasts right before dawn, but the voices weren't local accents. Military sounding, calm, talking about evacuation points that didn't exist on any map she knew. I said, "Foreign?" She said, "No, domestic, but fragmented, like they were reading from old scripts." Breakfast was quiet. Marina whispered a prayer before anyone sat down, her voice barely above the kettle's hiss. Gianna fed her son with one hand while keeping the other on his back. Everyone's movements felt mechanical, like we were going through a checklist to prove we were still human. I asked Noah to check the generators again, making sure the fuel valves were sealed tight. He said everything ran fine, but he wanted to reposition the smaller unit to the lower garage, where sound would be dampened. Renee agreed. I approved it without discussion. The new rule was simple. Noise draws attention. At 9:40, the power grid flickered twice. Not a full outage, just a hesitation. The lights dimmed, surged, and steadied again. It was enough to silence the room. Harold looked up from his shortwave and said he'd heard the same kind of surge years ago during a regional blackout. Only this time, the grid came back too fast. He thought maybe the city had switched to automated balancing. No humans left at the controls. Renee didn't disagree. By mid-morning, the first visitor appeared. Not at the gate this time, but on the service road below. A man pushing a bicycle with a large duffel bag strapped to the frame. He wore hospital scrubs, sleeves rolled to his elbows, shoes soaked dark. He stopped near the ditch, looked around, then leaned the bike against a post and waved toward the property. Derek saw him on the feed and asked for direction. I told him to wait. The man didn't approach, just shouted that he needed water and a place to rest. His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Renee stood beside me listening, face pale. She said, "He's infected." I asked how she knew. She said, "It's in the voice. There's no rhythm to it." We watched until the man sat down in the grass and stopped moving. 20 minutes passed before he stood again, staggering toward the trees instead of the road. Derek followed him with the camera until he vanished behind the fog. That was our first confirmed sighting on the hill itself. I told Derek to power up one of the sentry platforms and position it near the corner of the fence. No active fire authorization, just tracking. He said he'd handle it. By noon, Noah had the smaller generator moved and hooked into the secondary circuit. The sound dropped almost completely, just a low pulse through the concrete floor. Sophia helped run the extension cabling, taping the junction points. She moved efficiently, not speaking unless necessary. When I asked how she was holding up, she said she kept busy because thinking too long didn't help. I respected that. At 1:30, we got another power flicker followed by a dead silence. The house systems paused, then the backup battery kicked in. The sudden quiet after the hum cut out was unsettling. No refrigerator, no fan, no distant engines, just the weight of still air. Derek's voice came through the intercom, saying he saw movement again near the lower slope. 3 figures this time, walking in uneven steps, stopping every few yards to look around. They didn't appear organized. Renee joined us in the comms room, watched through the thermal feed. One of the figures suddenly dropped to the ground while the others kept walking. A minute later, the fallen one rose again, jerking upright like something pulling a string. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Renee finally said, "That's not exhaustion." I asked if she was sure. She said, "You don't get back up that fast from collapse." I told Derek to engage the floodlight for 2 seconds. The beam cut through the fog, revealing 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman, all wearing civilian clothes smeared with dirt. The woman turned her face toward the light, eyes wide open, mouth slack, moving her jaw as if chewing. Then she bolted straight at the fence. Derek shut the light off instantly, and the fog swallowed them again. We didn't turn it back on. After that, we locked into silence mode. No machinery above necessary load, no outdoor activity after sunset, no open conversation near windows. I told everyone the rule was simple. If they could hear you, they could find you. Gus took it personally, moving through the house checking seals, closing vents, padding the generator enclosure with foam panels. He'd worked in industrial zones long enough to know sound travels farther than sight. The afternoon dragged. Renee sat with Marina and May, preparing medical kits with pre-dosed packets labeled in thick marker. Gianna helped while holding her son close, bouncing him lightly whenever he stirred. The child didn't cry anymore, just watched everyone in silence. I took that as a small mercy. Noah and Sophia monitored the comms room, updating the security grid manually since the automated sync had failed. Every few hours they'd test the drones, but only lift them 20 feet, just enough to scan the perimeter without noise. At 5, Harold called me to the deck. The harbor was visible again through the thinning fog, and what we saw there made my stomach tighten. A ship was drifting close to the shoreline. A freighter by the shape, moving without lights or escort. It wasn't under power. The current was pushing it. Through binoculars, I could see figures on the deck. Not many, maybe 6 or 7, standing still against the railing. Renee came out, looked once, and said they were dead. I said, "They're standing." She said, "That doesn't mean alive." The ship ran aground an hour later with a metallic grind that echoed across the bay. No alarms, no rescue vessels, nothing. Just a quiet impact and silence afterward. I knew it would draw attention eventually. If infection spread through the crew, the shoreline was now another breach point. I instructed Derek to monitor the lower camera overnight and arm both platforms for manual control. He didn't question it. Dinner came later than usual. May reheated stored stew, while Renee distributed ration portions without comment. The conversation was hollow. People spoke because silence had weight. Harold told a story about the blackout of '77, how people danced in the streets when the lights came back. Nobody laughed. When he finished, Ova asked if we'd ever see lights like that again. Renee said, "Not soon." That was the end of dinner talk. After cleaning up, I met Derek at the east window to review the last hour's footage. Something had tripped one of the motion sensors near the drainage ditch. The thermal feed showed nothing at first, just static heat residue from earlier sunlight. Then, slowly, a faint shape crawled into view, low to the ground, moving unevenly. Derek leaned closer. The figure stood up halfway, turned its head toward the lens, and then vanished into shadow. He looked at me, waiting for an order. I said, "No lights, not yet." He nodded and powered down the external rotation. Renee took first watch that night. I sat with her until midnight, both of us silent except for the quiet tap of the keyboard as she logged observations. Around 11, faint movement appeared again on the outer road. A car rolled into view, headlights off, trunk half open. It coasted to a stop against the curb. No one got out. We waited, listening. A single rhythmic tapping started. Metal on metal, steady. Renee said it was a loose engine part shifting in idle. I said maybe. But the tapping kept going long after the car should have cooled. When the generator cycled again at midnight, the sound stopped. Before dawn, I checked the cameras one last time. The car was gone. Only 2 wet tracks remained on the asphalt, leading downhill. The shipwreck on the shoreline hadn't moved, but its lights were flickering faintly now, emergency strobes still firing in random bursts. I realized then that someone had turned them on during the night, or something had. The fog started to thin, just enough for the thermal feeds to pick up clearer shapes. Derek and I stood in the comms room reviewing footage when movement caught our attention near the bottom of the hill. 3 figures were running full speed down the middle of the street, their heads jerking, arms flailing. One of them tripped and hit the pavement but rolled right back up, didn't even pause. They weren't running from something. They were chasing. A sound carried faintly through the speakers, a strained, high-pitched noise that almost resembled a scream, but came too fast to be human. The feed zoomed in. Behind them, maybe 50 yards back, the same car from earlier tore down the slope, backfiring and fishtailing as the driver tried to control it. The infected chased it on foot, impossibly fast for the distance. The car swerved hard, clipped a mailbox, then kept going toward the bend out of view. 2 of the infected turned at the sudden noise from our fence. Gus had opened the tool shed door without warning, metal scraping on concrete. The sound cut through the still air like a flare. I shouted into the intercom, ordering everyone to lock it down. Derek switched cameras, tracking the 2 infected as they changed direction. They sprinted toward the fence line, full speed, no hesitation. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated, but fast enough to cover ground quickly. I gave the order to intercept before they reached the outer motion grid. "No firearms," I said. "Keep it silent." Derek understood. He grabbed his suppressed carbine and signaled Jared to flank from the rear gate. I followed them through the garage corridor and out to the yard. The morning fog still hung low, cutting visibility to 50 feet. Every sound felt amplified. The gravel crunch under our boots, the faint click of the motion sensor relay. We could hear the infected before we saw them, wet breathing, and the scrape of bare feet against asphalt. One slammed into the fence, rattling the steel mesh, while the other circled along the edge looking for a gap. Derek raised his carbine and fired once, the suppressed round snapping like a muffled hiss. The first infected dropped instantly. The second one turned, hissed, and started climbing. Jared was faster. He stepped forward with the spear tool we'd built for close defense, a reinforced steel pole with a sharpened tip. He drove it straight through the neck and pinned the infected against the fence until the twitching stopped. Then he yanked it free, dragged the body down, and checked the perimeter for more. When the noise stopped, the silence hit even harder. Everyone froze, waiting to see if there were others. Nothing. Just the distant hum of the generator and the low cry of gulls down by the water. Renee came out onto the porch with her radio pressed to her ear, whispering, "Did they see you?" I said, "Doesn't matter now." She nodded once and went back inside. We moved fast to clear the bodies. They were still warm, blood running dark down the cracks in the pavement. The smell was sharp, chemical, like metal mixed with rot. Gus and I rolled them onto tarps and dragged them behind the garage. I told him we couldn't leave them anywhere visible. The sight alone could bring others. We loaded them into the old utility cart and drove them half a mile down the service path toward the drainage ditch. The plan was simple: dump, cover, leave no trace. When we reached the ditch, fog drifted low across the road, and you could still hear faint movement from the city, sirens or echoes of them. Gus looked at the bodies before we rolled them off the cart and said, "Feels wrong, doing this like garbage." I said, "They stopped being people the moment they came at the fence." He didn't reply, just pushed one over the edge. The splash echoed, then faded into the fog. When we got back, Derek was waiting near the fence post with his weapon slung and his jaw tight. He said 2 more infected had appeared near the bend after we left but wandered off toward the docks instead. He'd kept everyone inside and powered down external lights until the movement passed. I thanked him and told him to reinforce the outer mesh with more wire. He said he was already on it. Renee met me inside, standing by the kitchen sink washing her hands. She didn't ask what we'd done with the bodies. She just said, "You should burn the tarps." I asked how she knew. She said, "It's in the smell." I nodded, grabbed the tarps from the garage, and threw them into the burn barrel out back. The smoke that came off them clung to my clothes for the rest of the day. By late morning, everyone gathered in the dining room for what passed as a meeting. I laid out the situation clearly: confirmed infection near the property, potential breach points, and a complete communications blackout from the mainland. Derek wanted to double the night shifts. Renee agreed, but said we couldn't exhaust people this early. May suggested rotating 2-person patrols in 6-hour cycles. I accepted that plan. It was practical and still allowed rest. After the meeting, I took inventory with Noah in the storage wing. We had 12 full fuel drums, 6,000 rounds across mixed calibers, and enough food for 18 months if rationed properly. The numbers should have comforted me, but they didn't. Supplies mean nothing if you can't protect them. I told Noah to lock down the ammo cache and disable the external generator's manual start. No one outside this family was to touch it. He hesitated, then asked if I trusted the guards. I said, until they stop trusting themselves. In the afternoon, we picked up fragments of new broadcasts. Military units were reportedly establishing safe corridors across the mainland, though no one confirmed locations. One voice mentioned evacuation triage. Another repeated civilian containment. Renee said both phrases meant the same thing, heard them and sought later. I turned the radio off before anyone else heard. That night, the fog returned thicker than before. The fence lights stayed off per protocol, but the motion sensors still pulsed on the monitor in soft blue flashes. Around 9, one tripped near the southern stretch. Derek checked the feed, 2 silhouettes moving slowly, not running this time. They drifted closer until they touched the fence. One pressed its face against the steel, eyes darting, mouth moving without sound. I told him to let them pass. No engagement unless they tried to climb. A minute later, they turned and stumbled away, drawn by some noise farther down the hill. Inside, I found Renee in the comms room writing another list. Antibiotics, bleach, sterile pads, ethanol. She said we'd lose our edge if infection reached the staff. I told her the infection was already here. It just hadn't found its way through the gate yet. She didn't deny it. She said, "Then the real fight hasn't even started." I said, "No, it's just begun." The next morning began with a kind of organized quiet. For the first time in days, the air outside didn't smell of salt or rot. The fog had cleared overnight, leaving the city visible again, but it looked drained of movement. No ferries, no traffic hum. The skyline just stood there, towers lit by the last pulse of electricity, and nothing else. From the deck, I could see the faint glint of barricades set up on Richmond Avenue, maybe 2 miles out. Harold said he'd heard chatter that a few off-duty officers had reopened a precinct as a walk-in advisory center. They were trying to keep some order, printing one-page bulletins and dropping them at corners for anyone still in the open. Renee said that meant they hadn't received real command updates in at least a day. Nobody operates on paper unless the network's dead. By 8, I'd reorganized our rotation schedule. We had too many people doing the same tasks and not enough coordination. Renee took charge of gate hygiene, disinfectant protocols, air seals, mask rotation. Harold handled water filtration and fuel levels, keeping the tanks and wells on a single chart. Marina paired with May in the kitchen, managing storage and meal distribution. Noah ran cameras and drone charging cycles, while Owen took the first overnight roving patrol with Zahir inside the house. Gus, still half running on nerves and stubbornness, kept working the fence, welding new braces until sparks covered his gloves. Everyone had a role again. It brought back a thin sense of control, but it was built on sand. Around 9, I stepped out to the gate with Derek to inspect the repair points. The steel frame still held, though the lower supports had bent slightly where the infected had slammed against it 2 nights ago. Derek said we could reinforce it with crossbars once the generator cycle ended. He spoke plainly, eyes fixed on his work, no small talk left in him. We'd both crossed that line already. Words only wasted time. By late morning, the first real sign of the world trying to pretend it still functioned appeared. Gus came up the drive holding a single printed sheet he'd found wedged between the outer fence posts. A government seal copied poorly across the top, crooked and grainy, with bold letters underneath. Curfew begins at 9 p.m. Stay indoors. Carry identification. Obey checkpoint instructions. The rest was smaller print, half blurred from moisture. No signatures, no date. Just a seal, an order, and a warning. Renee stared at it for a long time before saying, "Someone's still pretending to be in charge." I said, "Or they're just hoping the illusion holds a little longer." At noon, Derek radioed in from the south corner, voice calm but clipped. He'd spotted a white panel van coming up the hill, same type we'd seen before. It slowed as it reached the bend, engine running smooth, plate taped over. I told him not to engage unless it stopped. It didn't. It rolled past slowly, the driver glancing toward our fence without expression, then continuing down the slope. The image burned itself into memory. Not fear, just the certainty that whoever was inside had already marked this place. Derek followed the van with his rifle lowered and said, "Next time, we won't wait for them to knock." Inside, Renee was disinfecting the main entry handles and the staircase railings. She said she'd started smelling something faint near the back vents, like mildew mixed with ammonia. I sent Noah to check, thinking it might have been residue from the new filters we'd installed. He crawled through the lower access corridor and came back saying the vent housing was fine, but the external grate showed fingerprints in the dust. Someone, or something, had touched it recently. I told him to seal it from the inside with mesh and bolts. He didn't argue. By mid-afternoon, the internet connection began flickering. Pages would half-load, freeze, then return to cached data from the day before. Ava tried to message her friends, but none of the texts went through. She sat on the stairs with her phone in her hand, screen lighting her face, eyes fixed and empty. I asked who she was trying to reach. She said, "Mira and Lucas. They live near the precinct." I said, "If they went there, they're probably safe." She didn't look up when she answered, "Probably isn't safe. Then she turned the phone off. The afternoon dragged under a quiet tension. Gus tested the generator valves again, while Derek laid out additional wire coils for the inner perimeter. Marina kept the kitchen warm, trying to make the place feel like a home instead of a bunker. The smell of stew drifted through the halls, softening the metallic odor of disinfectant. For a few minutes it almost felt like an ordinary winter day, until Harold came in with the radio pressed tight to his ear. He said he'd picked up new chatter from the old police band, and it wasn't organized. Fragmented voices were talking about block quarantines, civilians under control, and no transport north. Renee asked what it meant. Harold said it sounded like the last people still trying to sound official before vanishing. Around 5, a dull metallic bang echoed from the outer drive. Everyone froze. Derek checked the cameras. No people. Just a plastic trash bin rolling in the wind. But the bin hadn't been there before. Someone had dragged it from the roadside. It was little things like that which mattered now. The small movements that proved we weren't alone on the hill. I told him to reposition one of the drones for a thermal sweep before nightfall. He said the batteries were charging but would be ready in 10 minutes. Dinner that night was subdued. Everyone ate in near silence, utensils clicking softly against plates. Ava barely touched her food. Renee kept glancing at her across the table but didn't press. The sound of the generator pulsing through the floor filled the gaps where conversation used to live. When the power cycled down, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Marina tried to start a conversation about rationing, but nobody joined in. I could feel the weight of that one word, curfew, hanging in the air. It wasn't just a rule. It was an admission that the city no longer belonged to us. After dinner, I gathered everyone in the comms room for a short briefing. We'd begin a new rotation at dusk. 2 people outside on the yard patrol, 2 monitoring cameras, and 1 inside sweeping the halls. Renee assigned herself to the gate with Gus, refusing to rest. I told her to conserve strength. She said, "I can rest when there's something left worth resting for." I didn't argue. She'd earned her place. At 8:40, the power grid dipped again. Longer this time. The lights dimmed, flickered, then returned weaker. We waited for the next blackout. When it didn't come, I told Noah to reduce external power draw and shut off non-essential systems. The less attention we drew, the better. Outside, the air turned colder, the sky a dull, reddish haze reflecting off distant fires. The city looked like a painting left to fade. Before 9, Derek checked the lower camera feed one more time. He found movement again near the outer road. Just one figure this time, walking slowly, a large bag slung over the shoulder. The face was hidden by a hood. The person stopped under the streetlight, pulled something from the bag, and dropped it on the pavement. Then they walked away. Gus volunteered to check after dawn, saying it was probably another printed notice. Renee said she'd go with him. I didn't like the idea, but knew arguing would only waste energy. When curfew hour arrived, the city below was dark except for a few blinking lights in the distance. Somewhere near the harbor, gunfire echoed once, faint but clear, followed by a long, hollow silence. Nobody spoke. We just listened. The world had narrowed to our fence line, our rooms, our generator hum, and the occasional drone buzz that reminded us the property was still defended. For now. I stayed awake until well past midnight, watching the monitors cycle through empty streets. When I finally left the comms room, Renee was asleep in her chair, still holding her notebook, the word containment written again at the top of the page. By the time I woke again, the sun was already climbing through a grey haze, weak but steady. The power was still holding, and so was the water. For a second, that felt like hope. The morning broadcast came through on the emergency channel, flat, pre-recorded, and still pretending that non-critical emergency cases would be redirected to functioning hospitals. The announcer's voice didn't crack, but you could hear the strain in her pacing. She mentioned diversions like they were logistics, not lives. Renee sat by the window listening, arms crossed, jaw set. She said, "When they start admitting shortages, it's already past control." I said, "At least the lights are still on." She looked at me and said, "That's not comfort, that's delay." At 8, the freezer in the lower storage threw a fault alarm. It reset itself after 30 seconds, but the temperature log showed a 2-degree climb. Noah checked the panel and said the compressor had cycled twice overnight, probably due to low power fluctuation. I didn't want to risk it again. I decided we'd run a short controlled generator test tomorrow morning to give all the cold storage a hard chill. Half an hour at most, enough to stabilize everything without attracting attention. Renee agreed, but warned that one mistake with sound timing could bring visitors. I said we'd manage it carefully, down to the minute. The first sign of fracture came before dawn, quiet and almost polite. Derek was gone. No fight, no argument, just absence. His bunk was made, his rifle missing, and his gear locker empty except for a note folded on top. I opened it. No handwriting, just a printed text on my phone from his number. I will come back if the crossings loosen. That was all. Jared went with him. Gus found the back gate unlatched but not damaged. It wasn't desertion in panic. It was a decision made days ago. I showed the message to Renee. She said, he was loyal to the structure, not to us. I said, he still kept the lights on while we needed him. She answered, and now we need fewer lights. The loss hit Owen hardest. He'd relied on Derek's steadiness, his way of handling orders without emotion. Now the youngest guard looked hollow-eyed but determined. I gave him the night watch assignment in Derek's place. Paired him with Zahir for interior patrol. He didn't complain. I could tell he was relieved to have direction, something that didn't require choice. Renee told him to sleep after breakfast, and for once, he did. Outside, the city showed its first signs of physical decay. Trash collection had stopped in most areas, and the wind carried the smell across the bay. Small fires burned in clusters near the waterfront, probably from dumped waste or looters clearing shops. The hospital advisories had switched tone completely. No more reassurance, just blunt triage reports. One facility admitted oxygen shortages. Another said their backup power was limited to intensive care only, but the water still ran clear, and the power grid still pulsed through the skyline. Civilization hadn't collapsed yet. It was just thin ice holding too much weight. After lunch, I brought the sentry platforms inside the garage for maintenance. The outer fence could hold for another week without them, and I needed the units tested in controlled light. Each platform weighed close to 300 pounds, tracked movement by thermal contrast, and carried short-range deterrent systems. They'd worked perfectly so far, but the control software was glitching from network instability. Noah helped rewire the mainboard while I cleaned the actuator joints. He said the circuits looked fine, but the firmware might need an offline patch. I told him to isolate both systems from the main grid, no uplink until further notice. He looked relieved to have orders that made sense. When the repairs were done, I wheeled one of the units toward the rear garage door. The space felt smaller than before. Too many bodies, too many supplies, too many layers of defense closing in on themselves. I moved slowly past the locked cabinets and stopped at the reinforced door leading to the energetic materials magazine. Inside was everything we didn't talk about. Date cord, shaped charges, flash modules, defensive shells. I hadn't touched that stock since the first week. Still, I unlocked the door, checked the seals, and resecured it. Then I changed the combination. No announcement, no note. I just made sure people saw me relock it. By evening, the temperature had dropped again. The house creaked from the shift. Renee was in the kitchen with Marina, going over ration adjustments while May took inventory of the pantry. I stepped in long enough to hear them discuss the rotation for tomorrow. They spoke in half sentences, efficient and stripped of emotion. The family rhythm had turned military. Short, deliberate movements, soft voices, no wasted words. Gus came in halfway through, wiping oil from his hands, and said he'd reinforced the south gate hinges. He didn't mention Derek or Jared. I think he didn't have the energy to. Ava stayed upstairs most of the day, quiet and disconnected. I checked on her once in the afternoon and found her sitting on the floor beside the bed with the curtains closed, scrolling through her phone. The screen displayed the same unread messages from her friends. No replies. I didn't tell her to stop trying. Hope is its own medicine, even when it's useless. When I left the room, she whispered that the city lights looked dimmer than before. I didn't tell her that some parts had already gone black. The freezer held steady after the morning fault. I double-checked the internal gauge before dinner. The readout blinked green again. Small victories mattered now. At 8, Harold came into the comms room with his shortwave receiver. He'd been scanning the maritime band and picked up a strange looped signal repeating every 90 seconds. The voice was mechanical, alternating between English and coded bursts. It mentioned secured corridor and northern route not viable. I told him to record it, but by the time he tuned back, the signal was gone. Renee said it was probably a distress beacon, maybe automated from a patrol ship. I didn't argue. Dinner felt wrong. Not tense, just smaller. Missing voices leave space you can't fill with conversation. The kids ate without looking up. Gianna fed her son while staring at nothing. Renee tried to hold the line of normalcy, but the cracks were showing in her patience. When she passed me the serving bowl, her hand trembled slightly. I caught it without drawing attention. She pulled away and said quietly, "You can't fix everyone's fear by locking another door." I said, "Doors keep what's left of us safe." She said, "Safe from what? Them or ourselves?" Then she stood and left the table. That night, I went through the garage again, checking every latch, every battery connection, every camera angle. The lights hummed low and steady. I could feel the faint vibration of the generator running in low cycle mode, keeping the house just above silence. Owen passed me on his round, nodded, and said everything was quiet. He said, "Feels too quiet, sir." I told him quiet was survival now. He smiled once, short and tired, and kept walking. When I returned to the comms room, the power monitors were steady. The network lights blinked rhythmically. Everything looked controlled, but the calm felt false, like ice over deep water. Every light, every hum, every breath in that house relied on a fragile system that could vanish with a single overload. I sat there watching the displays until my eyes blurred, thinking about Derek and Jared walking somewhere beyond the bridges, betting on a world that might already be gone. At dawn, the first broadcast of the day opened with the word order. No more advisories, no appeals for calm. The voice, same anchor, same dry control, said the city had extended curfew indefinitely. Movement after 9 p.m. was now a violation. Bridge crossings were restricted to essential travel, medical staff, freight, and public safety only. The tunnels remained sealed. She didn't mention how people were supposed to prove they were essential. Renee leaned against the doorframe listening, arms folded. She said, "Orders without enforcement are just words." I said, "Words still keep people from testing the edge." She said, "Until they get hungry." The power flickered twice around 7. The lights dimmed, steadied, and dimmed again before holding. The grid was still functioning, but the rhythm had changed. It was pulsing now, not constant, as though parts of the city were going dark for minutes at a time, while others absorbed the excess. The water still ran, the gas stove worked, and the internet lagged but didn't collapse. Civilization was wounded, not dead, yet everyone felt the balance tightening. One more surge, one more failure, and the illusion would break. We began the generator window at precisely 9. Gus started the cycle while I monitored the load on the control screen. The plan was strict. 30 minutes of heavy run to hard chill the freezers and test the big unit under real strain. Owen took position on the roof with the binoculars, eyes on the hill. Zahir waited by the driveway with the rifle, scanning the road through the fog. The rest of us stayed silent inside, counting minutes. The generator roared to life, its low vibration filling every floor. I kept the display open, tracking wattage spikes. It ran clean, smooth, controlled. At the 30-minute mark, I gave the cut signal. The power tapered down, the hum faded, and the house returned to that delicate quiet we'd learned to call safety. Renee exhaled like she'd been holding her breath the entire time. She said the freezers were reading colder than before, a full backup cycle complete. I nodded and told Gus to record every reading for reference. Maintenance was turning into ritual now, something we did not because it changed the outcome, but because it reminded us we still had outcomes to protect. Around noon, Harold came in from the porch with his radio. He'd been listening to shortwave chatter again and said one of the old law enforcement frequencies was still active. running a distorted feed of what sounded like crowd control reports. The signal was weak, fading in and out with static. I tuned the console to match, and through the noise came a single clear sentence. Checkpoint 4 under pressure, crowd surge near barriers, medical on scene. Renee stepped closer, frowning, and said, "That's Richmond." The feed cut, then returned as a news stream on one of the few working local channels. A live shot showed a street lined with plastic barricades and makeshift tape. A few dozen people stood in line outside what used to be the old precinct building. They looked calm at first, bundled in coats, holding bags, faces turned toward the officers. Then, in the middle of the frame, one man dropped. The movement was small at first, then chaos followed like a chain reaction. The crowd surged forward, shouting, pushing. Officers yelled for everyone to stay back, while two paramedics forced a gurney through the line. The sound was half static and half panic. One of the officers slipped, fell, and disappeared beneath the bodies pressing in. The camera feed jolted before cutting to the anchor, her voice trembling as she said, "We are receiving temporary disturbances from our field unit." I turned the screen off. Renee stood beside me, arms wrapped tight around herself. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. The room was filled with the quiet hum of the power console and the faint buzz of the emergency light. I finally said out loud what we'd both been thinking. "We are done with crossings." The words came out flat, final. That was the pivot point, the line between us and the rest of the world. The hill above the road, the fence, the walls, all of it became more than boundaries. They became borders. Renee didn't argue. She just nodded and walked out to start disinfecting the entry hall again. That afternoon, Sophia approached me while I was in the garage, rechecking the sentry platforms. She asked for 5 minutes to talk, and I could tell by her tone it wasn't about equipment. We sat near the workbench, the faint smell of oil and dust filling the air. She said her brother had sent a message before the network started collapsing. He was stuck near the industrial park, working security at a logistics depot. She'd finally managed to retrieve it from her cached inbox. The message was short: "Holding for evacuation. Route blocked. Don't wait for me." She asked if there was any chance of getting him out. I didn't answer right away. The distance wasn't impossible, but the roads between here and there were broken by barricades and abandoned cars. It would take planning, fuel, and luck, none of which we could spare. I wrote the address down on a scrap of paper anyway, folded it, and handed it to her. I said, "We will decide after the weekend. Not today." She looked disappointed but didn't argue. She said, "That's not a no." I said, "No, it's the only honest answer I can give you right now." She nodded once and left the garage without another word. The paper stayed in my pocket for the rest of the day. By evening, the air had turned cold again, sharp enough to sting when you stepped outside. The power flickered once more at dusk but recovered within seconds. The city skyline remained faintly lit in patches, pockets of stubborn energy refusing to die. I walked the perimeter with Gus, checking the locks and wire tension. He said nothing the entire time. When we reached the south fence, he finally spoke. "If this keeps going, people will start looking for houses like this." I said, "They already are." He nodded once and didn't say another word. The family ate dinner in shifts that night. No table, no conversation, just plates passed between rooms. Harold stayed near the radio, listening for any sign of organized command. Renee worked through the cupboards, rearranging supplies for easier access in emergencies. Ava sat in the kitchen doorway, watching everyone move without joining in. When I asked if she was all right, she said she didn't feel sick, just heavy. I told her she wasn't alone. She said, "I know. That's what makes it harder." Then she stood and left the room. After dark, I shut down non-essential circuits and dimmed the hallway lights. The city below was still visible through the trees, glimmers of movement, distant sirens, a few red strobes marking intersections that no longer mattered. At 9:30, the house settled into its night rhythm. Owen started his patrol, flashlight off, shoes silent on the tile. Zahir manned the comms room while I checked the front monitors one last time. Sometime after 11, the gate bell rang. Just once, sharp and clean. I froze, Hand still on the edge of the desk, eyes locked on the monitor. Whoever pressed it didn't wait to be seen. The camera picked up a blur of movement. A shoulder in a dark coat, the edge of a pack, maybe a fold of cloth. And then nothing. No face, no voice, no attempt to speak. Just a retreating figure vanishing out of frame. The motion sensor light flicked on, caught part of the driveway, then blinked off after a few seconds. I stayed there staring at the screen long after it was black again. I didn't reach for the mic, didn't zoom. I just watched the shadows, waiting for something to return. It didn't. Renee came down the stairs slowly, rubbing her forehead. She stopped behind me and looked over my shoulder. Her voice was low, still thick with sleep. "Someone we know?" I shook my head. "No. Or if we did, they're not that anymore." She crossed her arms and didn't move for a while. Then she said, "Gate stays shut from now on. No warnings. No exceptions." I didn't argue. The rest of the night was stiff with silence, the kind where nobody trusts the quiet. The wind rattled something metal near the east fence, and I logged the time, but didn't send anyone out. Every decision now came down to risk. We weren't conserving strength. We were preserving lives. Power held. Water pressure dipped slightly but never failed. Sirens came and went in the distance, rising, stopping, restarting again. At one point, I swear I heard a loudspeaker barking orders 2 hills over, but the words were shredded by trees and fog. Inside, nobody really slept. People laid down in shifts, but the kind of sleep we got now wasn't rest. It was something closer to unconscious maintenance, just enough to get back on our feet. I stayed up until close to 3, watching monitors, checking power, flipping through offline maps on the tablet, looking at areas I knew we wouldn't go near anymore. The bridges, the checkpoints, the streets we used to know. By morning, there was no need to say anything. Nobody brought it up at breakfast. The bell, the figure, the silence that followed. Marcus gave out the day's assignments like normal. Noah started rewiring the drone charger. Renee ran another supply inventory with Marina. Gus repaired a cracked joint in the fence bracket by hand, working slow and methodical like he needed the noise to stay focused. But it was clear. We'd passed some kind of line. The city didn't feel like it was on the edge anymore. It felt gone. The quiet was different now. Not just outside. Inside us too. At 10:43 a.m., the perimeter alarm tripped again. A silent ping. Low priority. Motion detection from the rear slope. Sector 12. Unusual. Not a common approach path. I pulled it up on the tablet and leaned closer. There was a figure in the brush. Still. Watching. No bell this time. Just eyes, wide open, staring toward the house. That's all for now, Survivor. Thanks for listening. If you want to keep these stories alive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. And a huge thank you to everyone supporting this channel with extra memberships, especially Carlos Herrera, Luca Mod, Jedala, The Great Anywho. Thanks. Also drop a comment and let me know what story you want to hear next. Jack's Nightmares signing off.